Oh no!
Awesome.
Mind my business!
Fail.
Mind my business.
Oh yeah.
Mind my business.
Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of Mind My Business. It's our opinion podcast from Hype 1000, and we're a corporate audio startup. I'm your host Max. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hype 1000, and today I would like to talk to you about Twitter and social media in general. Taking the opportunity as it was announced today that Elon Musk is purchasing Twitter for around $41 billion. I wanted to take the chance to have a look at, the ways of promoting your podcast and which platform might be an interesting platform to go about promoting your corporate podcast. And I thought about, Twitter, I think Twitter launched its live audio feature called Spaces, if I'm not mistaken, or it's some kind of like audio room that you have created. But taking that into consideration, Twitter is pretty much a very opinionated platform. It kind of dictates the political discourse, but it can also be an interesting tool or an interesting channel if you have a podcast in the B2B environment, especially if you're a media company, to get your podcast across to your audience in that space of Twitter and promote it there. Could be something really interesting. Because generally or currently, the advertising possibilities for your podcast, if you decide to do a corporate podcast in the B2C environment. So if you want to reach somebody outside your organization that is not specifically a client of yours, but you want to create something for new leads or for consumers in general, where you want to be publicly recognized with the content you're creating. Still today, you need other platforms to promote your podcast. So one thing, and that's becoming a bit tricky because if you create a website, that's generally your final point of destination. If you have your own shop or where you have your website in a contact form, that's where you want to get your people or into your CRM system. With a podcast, you kind of want that as an engagement tool on the one hand, because it doesn't really work as an awareness tool, because creating awareness would mean that you get maximum exposure, and that for a podcast doesn't really work. And the format itself, kind of what is working in a podcast, is more intimate. It's more a long time engagement, a closer engagement, everything we know about podcasting and why it works. So it's more of an engagement tool than an awareness tool. And if you want to create engagement, it is not the final platform where you want your consumers. So you don't have that engagement at the moment. Spotify and Apple worked on that by creating subscriptions, which can be interesting, but it's still not necessarily where you generate information about your audience. So you would need another step to get them from the podcast to somewhere else. So, that could be something where you try to get people to a platform like Twitter, where you have those followers, but then you again have the problem in that space where you use social media platforms as a promotional tool for your podcast to get that reach, to get the impression, to get awareness to that podcast. Really depending on the audience, Twitter can be really interesting. Because you get a lot of experts, you got a lot of people with opinions on that platform. So you can possibly, to your liking or against your liking, start a conversation and interaction with your community there. You can, of course, use the classic promotional tools from the Facebook or Meta universe. On Instagram, for example, where you redirect people to your platform. For example, Spotify is doing that quite frequently doing promotions on, you know, certain artists or certain playlists on Instagram. So that could be interesting as well. So overall, social media as a promotional tool or as a promotional channel to bring attention to the podcast that you're having can be really interesting and can be a way to get people on board, and it then works through the same kind of mechanics as you know on those social media platforms. That's in our experience, or in my personal experience with podcasts, that was in most times the most relevant tool, because that's where generally people are online, they're mobile, on their mobile devices, so they can easily switch to a platform like Apple Podcast or Spotify to listen to. But you know, it would be much more interesting to see new promotional features in Spotify, either on the side of making your podcast, creating more awareness and getting more impressions out in, I don't know, a community space in that you possibly could get in the same kind of like algorithm mechanics that you know from social media platforms. That could be really interesting in like a sort of a timeline to see that happening, or integrated even in Spotify. Or, you know, could be really interesting as a platform. Facebook or the Meta company just stopped their podcast movement. I think also due to the fact that they're quite closely connected to Spotify. But for example, a company like Twitter, that is really into, like, now with Elon Musk thinking about, you know, I want to be a platform for open speech or free speech. And with the kind of like discourse that you've seen with Joe Rogan on Spotify, it could be interesting to see, for example, an audio video feature in Twitter, and that becoming a new kind of like platform for podcasts and videos, and create that new kind of space that merges that social media aspect with functionalities of YouTube and Spotify. So yeah, could be interesting to see how we see the shift or the combination of social media and podcasting in the future. I think there's some potential there. Today it's kind of like all loosely connected, but it's going to be interesting to see what's coming in the future. At least that's my opinion on it. And yeah, I would like to hear you tomorrow in a new episode of Mind My Business.
Why don't you mind your business?